Is there anybody here who doesn't know who General Patton is? I thought not. He is probably the icon that is most notable for World War II today. You wear the Patton breeches, the riding crop, and the helmet, and right away they know who that is. But he's captured more than that. He's captured the American psychic. We all wish that occasionally there was another General Patton that would ride over the hill and take care of the many problems that we have and would be unabashed and unafraid and lead like he led. But he wasn't a perfect man. Now, somebody asked me, well, they said, General Patton, tell us a little about your life. And I said, well, glad you asked me that question. Let me do that. You didn't know you asked that, did you? You did it, did you? Say yes. Yes. All right, okay.
Yes, sir.
Good. Now, we're going to do this the Patton way. I'm right, and if you're wrong, it's a $20 fine, and we have a donation over there. So be careful what you ask. Now, most people have seen the movie, and it opens with General Patton, and he comes out, and he has all the medals and the ribbons, and he's talking to the troops, and he gives them a very inspiring speech. And he did give a very inspiring speech, but he didn't have all the medals. He had yet to win those medals yet. He wore this uniform once, and his wife wanted him to put all of his stuff on and take a picture of it, and he did. And that has probably become the image of General Patton all these years with the medals, and of course you saw the movie. And if it was not for the movie, you probably he would have gone into history. But he captured something in that movie in 1970 because that was the Vietnam War was going on, and all of a sudden you have a story about an American general who was bigger than life, and everybody took notice. Because of the movie, book after book after book began to read. And so I'm going to take you back in history, and I'm going to show you a man that you probably didn't know about, and tell you some stories that maybe you didn't know. And I've had also the pleasure to meet a couple of his grandchildren, and they're just delightful people. And his family carries on the tradition, and they go all over the world talking about the heritage. So now, I was born in 1885 on November 11th. Now, that's a fairly old man when you consider today is 2010, but he grew up in California. He was a son of George S. Patton Sr. and Ruth Wilson Patton, and they really loved him. They coddled him, and they were fairly well-to-do. And so there's a lot of photographs of him as growing up, and a lot of people didn't have the opportunity to have photographs back then. So we see him at a young age, and he hated this look. They kind of dressed him up in a little sailor suit, and he just assumed people didn't see that. But he wasn't a bad-looking young man. But as he grew, he wanted to pursue a career in the military. That was not a high registered type pursuit back then. If you wanted to be in the military, people kind of looked at you funny because to them, you went into the military if you couldn't do anything else. Well, to him, there wasn't anything else he wanted to do. That was just what he felt. Now, let me give you a little bit of background. He came from a family with military history, and his family talked about history all the time, and he grew up knowing a lot of Civil War veterans, and they would come to his father's house, and he would talk with them, and he would hear the stories of the Civil War, and he'd lost a grandfather at one of the battles, and the war was a way that man would reaffirm himself, and he would carry on a family tradition. And so little Georgie, as they called him, he really wanted to carry on that tradition. He thought about nothing else. And so he grew up. I know a lot of us grow up playing soldiers, then some of us don't grow up. But like some of the women are laughing. You know what your husband's toys are like, don't you? And but Georgie had a passion about it. He studied the battles as a young child. Now, because they were well-to-do, he had a nanny, and he didn't go to school for a while, and he grew up learning, being taught to read and stuff, so he didn't have the educational background. There's some debate whether he was dyslexic or not. I don't think so. It's possible, but I've seen some of his writings. There were some things he just had trouble with, and when you're not tutored from the beginning into school, the catch-up process is a little hard. He entered VMI Military Academy, and he stayed there waiting to be accepted into West Point, which he was, and he excelled in West Point in everything except math. That just was not his forte. And they allowed him to take one more year of West Point to get through it. So most folks made it in 4, he made it in 5. But in everything else, he was exemplary. His uniform was perfect. His esprit de corps was perfect. He embodied everything that you would want a soldier to embody, and he just ate it up. And he had to study long hours. It didn't come easy for him. Some people think that, well, he was a genius and he, it just came to him. No, he had to work hard at it. He had to work real hard at it. And during West Point, he had a sweetheart, and her name was Beatrice Eyre. Now, Beatrice come from a very well-to-do family, and when they found out that she was considering George, they said, "No, man, he's in the Army." And of course, the father came up to George and said, "Hey, don't you want to do something else? And there's something you would like to do?" And he said, "Well, no." And so eventually, the Frederick Eyre was resolved that he was going to have a son-in-law in the Army. Of course, he worked on him for a while. When you get out of the Army, you can have a real job. He said, "No." That was the determination he had. He said he believed that you set your sight on something and you let nothing stop you no matter what happens, and you keep after that goal until you achieve that goal. Well, there's a novel idea. Wish our kids today knew that one. He excelled as a cavalryman. We don't remember horses in our armed forces today. About the only time we see them is at a funeral. And we see the long caissons and the boots turned backwards, and we remember of a time past. But he grew up that way. He grew up, he excelled as a horseman. They rode horses all the time. He played polo. He had he was independently wealthy, not by today's wealth, but he was well off. And so the monies that he made in the Army, he didn't take his paycheck, and they existed. Imagine a pure soldier, someone who was there because they wanted to be there, not because of the money, not because of any other reasons. That was his calling in life. So he excelled in that. I want you to think about taking a horse at a gallop and jumping over something on top of a bridge with the water on both sides. And then keeping going and taking your pistol and firing it and hitting the target, or taking your saber out. And that type of equestrian skills today it would be very rare to see. Yet this is how they train. Now, he had a famous saying. It said, "Do not take counsel of your fears." Everybody take counsel of your fears? Aren't you just a little afraid to do something that you don't know what it is you're doing? And have you ever talked yourself out of it? I have. Well, he thought, what is this thing fear? He even wrote a poem about it. And the reason he learned that axiom that he used in World War II and before was because he was training a group of men to ride horses there, and they had a hill, pretty tall hill, and they had to go down this hill, and it was about a 45-degree angle. It was dirt, and then they had to cross a small river, come back around, cross the small river again, and go back up the hill. Now, these guys, they'd not ridden, they were on remounts. They weren't sure what these horses were going to do, and they weren't good riders. They were learning. They enlisted, and all of a sudden they're in the cavalry. You want me to do what? And they were sitting there, and if you've ever ridden a horse and you start shaking, the horse goes, what do I got on top of me? And then they start shaking. And then he sent and what they were doing was they had taken counsel of their fears, and they were defeating themselves before they ever got started. And so he sent one of his sergeants up, and sergeant lead horse went down, the other horses followed, and the men went, whoa, hey, oh, yeah. And they went across that, and they came back around, and they went down, and went across, came back around, and he had to stop them for fear that they would kill the horses because they were enjoying themselves so much. But an hour before, they were scared to death. He said, do not take counsel of your fears. We do that a lot. We take counsel of our fears. But what that really meant is with the proper training, you can learn to do most anything, and don't be afraid to try something new. And once you get good at it, you don't need to be afraid of it. If I told you to run into a building today that was on fire, you'd say, I'm nuts. But if you were a fireman and you were trained, you could do it. See the difference? One's stupidity, one's training. That was the point he was trying to get across. There's his beautiful bride on May 26, 1910, Beatrice Eyre and Lieutenant George Patton married. And it was a storybook marriage. His entire life, whenever he was away a lot, he wrote home to her. And she wrote back. And that is how we know so much about him, is because he kept diaries, and he wrote, and she wrote back, and she kept all the letters, or a great many of them. And so Martin Blumenson, after the movie, wrote a set of books called the Patton Papers. And these are his diaries, and it takes him for his letters and the diaries and the things he wrote from before he was in West Point all the way through World War II. So if you're a Patton fan and you want to find out some of the more intimate details of his life, you can read those, and I strongly suggest it. All right? Patton wanted to get into battle so bad. But when there's not a war going on, what are you going to do? You can't go out and, well, he might have tried to start one. But he had to go, he had to do what he did. So he found out that General Pershing was going to mount an expeditionary force into Mexico. To give you a little background, in 1916, Pancho Villa raided Columbus in Mexico. They were having a revolt in Mexico. Things haven't changed. But they had the audacity to come across our border and raid one of in Columbus, Mexico. Well, that was 1916. And so Patton found out that this expeditionary force was going, and he wanted to go, but he was assigned to the wrong unit. So he camped out on General Pershing's doorstep, and now he didn't go, please sir, can I come? But he did everything else. But he was pretty smart too. He had a sister named Nina. She wasn't a bad looker, and Pershing was single. So he made sure he was a matchmaker. So before he knew it, he got to go to Mexico in the expedition as an aide to General Pershing. Now that was great. He was in the battle, and he thought that what else, this was his calling. So if you know anything, this is almost a forgotten war, but they chased Villa all over Mexico. They never found him. This guy knew everywhere he was, and they could get on the mountains, they could look down. But Patton, they had what was called touring cars, and they were motorized and like Model A's and T's and stuff, but they were in the military. They were trying a lot of equipment out at that time. There were new saddles, automobiles. They even had some biplanes because they knew they were fixing to get into World War I, so they sent all this new equipment down there to try out. Well, he took two of the cars and some men, and he got information at the town that two of Villa's lieutenants were going to be at a certain place at a certain time. And so they come rolling up there, and sure enough, there they were on horses, and one of them was for sure, and they saw, and gunfire took place, and he killed two of them. And blew one of them off a horse, and unfortunately killed the horse. And that bothered Patton more than the man. And then he did something that Pershing never forgot. Picked the saddle up, put it in the back of the car. He figured that was war booty. He put the 2 bandits that he killed, like deer, one on one car, one on the other, and they drove them all the way back to Pershing's headquarters in his tent and dropped the 2 dead bandits off and said, hey, look what I did, like deer hunting. Pershing went out, geesh. But he appreciated the man because he was doing something. And that became the first motorized attack ever done by the United States Army. And so he put 2 notches on his guns. And to give you an idea, this is a single action Army 45 caliber. This is a .357 Magnum. It's a model, it's a Smith & Wesson. That's the 2 that he carried. The holsters were made in El Paso Saddlery here in Texas. So he carried that. He thought that was pretty cool. He liked the Western atmosphere, and he liked the gunslingers. He thought they were pretty tough people. So that's why he carried the pistol that he did. Now, since I know all of y'all are Patton fans, we're gonna give you a test here. Here's your first test. These grips, what are they made out of? Ivory, that's right. And when I asked him about that, he said, are those pearl? He says, no, only a pimp in the New Orleans whorehouse would carry a pearl-handled revolver. Now, his language, and they tell me they're recording this thing and they're going to put it on TV, so I best not use his language. Although you can dial up any TV show today, and even our vice president's using the language, but I'm not. He had a way of talking. I'll tell you a little bit about his language. First of all, he didn't sound like this. I'm not going to go down to war. He didn't sound like that at all. He sounded, man, I want you to remember. Very high voice. Didn't sound like that. And so he would drink liquor and stuff and gargle and come out, all right, man. And he practiced in the mirror trying to look really mean, you know. And he pulled it off. But when you heard him speak, he would, all right, man, move that tank over there. You know, and you didn't picture that as this real He-Man. So when they did the movie, they decided they wouldn't do the voice. And probably if he had had anything to do with it, he'd agreed with them. So, but anyway, that particular action in 1916 gave him national recognition. Not because of any other reason. It was just, they did something. They couldn't catch Villa, so they finally did something. They at least killed a couple of his guys, and they had the stuff, and Patton became a hero. And of course, by every good man that you hear, wow, man, that man really did something, if you'll sneak around a little bit, you'll find out that his wife probably was the one that made sure everybody knew he was a good man. And that's what she did. She made sure when anything happened good about her, Georgie, she made sure that people knew about it, made it in the papers, and made it all as best it could, and perpetuated his career. If you ever read his writing, it's just hen-scratching. You have to go for quite a while to figure out what he said. He couldn't spell. That's why they seemed to think he had dyslexia. Believe me, he couldn't spell, but he didn't have a problem with that. And the reason he did it, he said, well, look, you know, y'all have to spell the same word the same way every time. I've learned several different ways to spell the same word. So Eddie had a sense of humor, and he was a loving man. He had a family, and he wasn't, you know, he was strict military. If you grew up in the military family, you know that a lot of the strictness comes home because it's drilled into him all the day. So he had a fairly strict household, but truthfully, his 2 daughters, they knew that he was a pushover. So they got what they wanted, but their rooms were clean, and you know their beds were all made up just right, and things were as he would want it. Pershing enjoyed Patton's flair and asked him to go over with him during World War I. Tanks were beginning to become something that the Army was looking into. The French had developed a light tank, and the British had a heavy tank. And they were bogged down in World War I in endless streams of trench warfare. And these places were just horrible. And there was thousands upon thousands of people killed in these trenches. and they were losing as many in the trenches for disease and trench mouth and trench foot and all the other things. And so they were trying to find these new wonder weapons that would move them out of the stalemate. And Patton was given the assignment of light tanks. And he took French Renault tanks, and as you see, he's standing behind one, and he developed them, and he studied them. And in fact, he was the only one who could actually move one and put it on a rail car, and he had to teach the rest of his command how to get it on a rail car just to get it to where it was going. That's just how important he thought these were going to be. And so he did the very best he could with these tanks, and he got to see action, and the tanks broke down, and there were some infantrymen around him, and he saw a machine gun nest, and Patton being Patton, by God, that machine gun nest needed to be taken. So there he went. And he said, "Come on, men, y'all follow me." Well, he said, "Come on, men, y'all follow me." And they did. And he looked around, and they were killed, all but one. And when he looked around, the machine gunner opened up, and according to Patton, shot me right here in the ass. Went all the way through. And you want to see? And he would do it. He would be at a party and say it exactly that way. And he was given a Purple Heart for that, but they had a wound Purple Heart back then. They didn't wear the Purple Heart that we wear today. And he also was decorated for gallantry and for his leading tank warfare. Okay, so he did well, and he wanted those medals because he had dreams of being a general. And he made the rank of colonel, and that was pretty quick because it was a specialized army, and you almost had to be there forever to go up in the ranks. So for someone to have done that quick and to be able to do what he did that quick took a very special man. And he studied all the time. He went to France. He developed a saber. The Army adopted his development of a saber. Today it's called the Patton saber. It's a big long thing. It's not curved, and it's for punching and bringing back. It's not for slicing. And they thought that was a wonderful thing that he had done. He thought the men ought to have the English-style saddle rather than the McClellan saddles. And the only reason they didn't adopt them is they couldn't afford them when World War I ended, and it just wasn't in the cards. But they did take the McClellan saddles and take all the rigging off the bottom of it and add two leather parts on the side so they were easier to get on and off a horse, and that was a Patton invention. He did so many things during the service that people don't know about that bring his fellow men and his a better chance to fight with and to have things go on. He was a dashing young man. He was 30 and achieved his colonelcy. It was a Distinguished Service Cross at the Meuse-Argonne operations, also he got his Purple Heart. I could go and tell you all the different things that he was assigned to from World War I to 1935, but a lot of it's just going from up one place to another as they assign. I will tell you a little bit about the tanks. When he was assigned to the Tank Corps after World War I, he became very good friends with a young man, his junior, by the name of Dwight David Eisenhower. And they had a wonderful relationship. They were good friends. And Eisenhower said that he would like someday to serve under Patton. If he ever got a big command, he would like to be his XO. That's how good of friends they were. They were so good of friends, I'll tell you a couple stories that are not well known. They were so interested in tanks that Eisenhower and Patton took a tank apart all the way down, every nut, bolt, and screw, and put it out there, and then challenged themselves to get it put back together again and run. And it did. And then they had an incident that only Patton and Eisenhower could have gotten into. They had water-cooled machine guns. Now, a 30 caliber machine gun water-cooled has a sleeve on it, and it fires, and the water keeps the barrel, supposedly, from getting too hot. Well, they wondered how hot that the barrel had to get before the bullets would start tumbling. So they decided and they had a lot of surplus ammunition from World War I, and they had permission to shoot it up. So there they went, and they kept shooting and kept shooting and they kept shooting, and the steam began to come off this gun, and finally when they were done, it was still loaded, but when they were done, they walked down to see the target. And all of a sudden, because it was so hot, it started shooting again, and they were downrange. And they went that way. and Patton come running up, and he twisted the belt on the machine gun so it would jam, and that was one of the stories that they tell. Eisenhower wrote about it years later in a book that he said, Stories That I Tell My Friends. And it's an excellent book if you ever have a chance to read it, because it kind of is off. He wrote it either while he was president or right after he was president. And it's one of those inside stuff that you wouldn't normally have seen in the stuff. Patton was assigned to Hawaii twice. And the second time he went over, he thought like his career was over because he was getting older. And once you get at a certain age, you don't get higher command. And he bought a sailing ship called the Arcticus, and he decided that he would study a sextant, he would study the stars, and he would sail from California to Hawaii to his new command. And he did it, and he sailed it, and he arrived where he was supposed to. It was just that mind of his that always had to keep going. He was 50 years old at the time. He had mixed feelings about what was going on. He loved horses. And in 1940, they had a series of maneuvers in Louisiana and all up and down to determine a couple of things. One of them was whether horses were viable in the United States Army. They'd pretty well decided they weren't, but they wanted to prove. They also wanted to see who the commanders were. And Patton was rated pretty high up there as being one of the choice commanders. Shortly before that, he had been assigned to Fort Myer, Virginia, and he thought he was done. Because if you know anything about the place, that's where all of the congressional leaders come, and that's where all they try to get appropriations for the services in the Army and so forth. And he was assigned there, pulled out of oblivion from Fort Bliss, from Fort Brackettville, whom he really liked being down there. And he thought, well, you know, I'll just go out and he knew the war was brewing. He didn't think anything happened. But he was good friends with Adna Chaffee, who was into tanks. And Chaffee knew him well and said, well, I want you to come and be my commander on tanks. And he was pretty well conflicted at it. But the Louisiana maneuver, he took the armored side and he beat the cavalry. And he had a general there by the name of Hugh Drum, whom he had words with. Well, actually, his words caused him to have words with. He was playing polo, and they were in a cuss fight in the polo in Hawaii, and they were turning the air blue. I mean, they were made up some cuss words that you can't even spell. And Drum was a very strict man, you know, and he called Patton down in the middle of the polo, and said, "Patton, you will relieve yourself. You relieved?" And the polo team was all good friends of his. You know, they were a lot of civilians. And they said, we're not playing if he ain't playing. In fact, we'll just stop the whole tournament. We won't play any more polo till he comes back. And it embarrassed Drum pretty bad. And he had to let the thing go on. And you just did not embarrass a superior officer. Wasn't a good thing to do. And Patton didn't. I mean, he didn't do that. The other people did. And he was a very strict man. He believed in the chain of command. So when he was called up, it was, yes, sir, and never said a word. But his friends stuck up for him. And during the Louisiana maneuvers, guess who he was against? General Drum. And on the first day, he captured him. And that was the end of General Drum's career. He stuck around for a little while, but that was pretty much the thing that. And General Marshall was looking at the people in command, and he was culling out all of the top brass because they were older, they were set in their ways. He needed young people, he needed young thinkers. And Patton was one of the very, very few people that was not culled because they knew him, they knew his command, they knew his command presence. And so, go ahead. He was picked to start training in the desert for North Africa. Churchill had convinced Roosevelt that we needed to open up another front. They didn't want to do it in England. They needed to fight the Germans somewhere. and North Africa was the best place they thought would be the great front to do, and the British were already down there. So Patton began to train troops in the desert. And it was, I mean, he put tents out there in the desert, and they trained in the desert, they slept in the desert, they ate in the desert. They would put gasoline in their helmets and light them, and they'd cook over the gasoline in their helmets. Boy, the EPA today would just jump up and down and scream, wouldn't they? And they said it didn't really taste as good as they'd like to have tasted, but they were trying things, and so they tried just about everything. And he was a crack shot, just a crack shot. They said that they'd see him tooling around on his half-track or his tank or even his command car, and he'd see a rabbit going around, he'd pull a .22 pistol, he'd knock the rabbit off. He was moving and the rabbit was moving. So that was the kind of, he was just into all of this kind of thing. Focused, totally focused on what he wanted to do. He didn't want to be just a general. He wanted to be the best general that they ever had. What a wonderful focus that would be, to think that you found a calling in life and you were going to be the very best at it that you could possibly be. And he believed in drive. And this is a good quote. This is one you don't hear much. He said, and this is important to read, "You have got to drive your body to the last inch of energy and then go on. You gain nothing but just going up to where you are exhausted. Your body will only build and grow to fit the man which the mind takes." So you push yourself. And when you're tired, you push yourself some more. And when you think you can't go, you go just a little bit further. The reason for that is, in real battle, they're just as tired as you are. So you push just a little bit harder than they did, and you're going to get the upper hand. And you say, the Nazis are not supermen, they're men, and we can beat them. And so he believed in drive. He was picked to command one of 3 different forces to land in North Africa in what was called Operation Torch in 1942. And we have a relic here in Texas that's part of that a lot of people don't realize. The battleship Texas fired its guns for the first time in anger during Operation Torch. It was off the shore there. Patton was commanding one group, and they landed, and he was all over the place. Historians believe, and I'm one of those people who believe, that had it not been for Patton in North Africa, it would not have gone the way that it did. In fact, it went so well for General Patton's forces, and he was able to do so much so quickly that he began to get a name for the American forces in the battle. Because remember, the British had been in the battles, and the war had been going on since 1939. And we were now supplying most of the equipment, most of the manpower, and everything else, but the British were in charge. And he wanted an American to have a little glory there. Well, he was a good commander, and he did a lot of things that would not normally have been done because he knew what he was doing and he could pull it off. No other commander out there probably could pull it off like he did. And when it was over, they knew they had a commander. They knew somebody could keep up with it. And so he shined there. It was also at this time that General Eisenhower, who was Roosevelt's pick, and Marshall wanted to be the commander, but Roosevelt thought Eisenhower would make a better field commander. Not because he thought less of Marshall, but he knew Marshall was capable of running the European theater and the Pacific theater with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and was too valuable a man to go anywhere but stay in Washington, D.C. And he knew that Eisenhower had that certain knack about him of getting along with everybody. And he felt like that would be a good man to put in charge. And he knew Patton. He could get along with Patton. And not many people could. So they said, okay, we'll do that. In the movie, you see the Kasserine Pass debacle, where the men were caught off guard, and they were ambushed, and they relieved the general, and they said, well, what are we going to do? And here comes General Patton. Let's give General Patton, and God help us, here comes General Patton. And then you see in the movie where Bradley and Patton are discussing, and he takes out a little box and says, he talks to Codman and says, put on, Codman, put them on, right there, 3 stars. And Bradley goes, well, don't you think they ought to confirm you? Well, they got my schedule and I have mine. Makes for a great movie. Totally untrue. Totally untrue. He was promoted by General Eisenhower to 3 stars. That was, Eisenhower pinned 3 stars on him, okay? He was a career military man. He didn't do those kinds of promotions like the movie, but it made for a great show. He was awarded, French Morocco was under rule by the Sultan of Morocco, and they had a special medal that they gave him, and it had an orange sash. So when you see the movie, this is the actual sash and medal that he wore, taken from the Patton Museum. To Patton, achieving the goal in battle was super important. And when he was in Sicily, is when he also developed that famous speech. And I got to tell you that there's nowhere close does the movie come close to his speech. And he did not say fornicating. It did start with an F, but it wasn't fornicating. And it was quite a bit. It was a blood and guts score. But part of the speech that you don't, you see, the movie speech doesn't make any sense. But when you read the whole speech in context, you understand he's trying to spur these men on. And there's parts in it that don't be afraid. You're not going to chicken out. And only 2% of people are killed in battle. You will make it through. You must do your duty. And he said a lot of things that you couldn't say today. He says there are some cowards in the army, you know. They need to be killed off so they won't go back and breed more cowards. You know, and I'm just, oh, I can't believe he said that. So this stuff came out of his mouth. And he meant it. But it didn't sound good. And so he saw that Montgomery was commanding, and then he was commanding. Now, if you saw the movie, you'd think it was those two. Wrong. General Alexander was in charge of that operation. He knew full well what Patton was doing. It was approved through General Alexander on the British side what he was going to do. He was to go take one side of Sicily, and Montgomery was going to take the other. And then he decided he was going to beat him to Messina. But that was already after he took his goal, and he did. Because he wanted to show that the American servicemen were every bit as good as any other servicemen in the world, and they were. Then he did something really stupid. And he'd tell you he did something really stupid. He slapped a soldier, slapped 2 of them. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about that incident you don't know. One of them came back later and said it's probably the best thing that ever happened to him because it straightened his life out. The other one, father actually said, I don't know why he did it, but he did it. He had detractors, Patton did, and it would have been kept in the house. Eisenhower, when he heard about it, was not pleased, neither was Bradley. And it began to snowball because it was caught by the press, and it made it to the Congress. And there was some question as to whether they were going to keep him. And he was kept in the doghouse. This was in 1943, in the summer of 43. And Eisenhower debated whether to keep Patton in charge. But he looked around at the other commanders, and he wondered, do I have somebody as good as him? If it came down to having to have somebody that good as a general, can I overlook what he did? And he discussed this with Marshall. This was not an arbitrary decision. It wasn't something that Eisenhower just did, and it wasn't based on their friendship. So in about November or early December of 1943, Eisenhower decided to retain Patton, but he wasn't sure in what capacity yet. So he sent orders to Patton to go to England and stand by for further orders. On the 31st of December 1944, Third Army was activated in the United States and told that they were to get all their stuff together, that they were moving out, and they were going to England to be part of the invasion of Europe. And still, Patton didn't know for another couple of days, and finally, Eisenhower was on a secret leave. He was in the States, and when he came back, he summoned Patton to his headquarters and gave him the command, and Third Army. And go ahead. He told Patton, I want you to shut up. Don't talk to anybody. Just command, you know, and keep out of the headlines. He says, I've gone way out on a limb on here with you. Way out. And Patton understood that. And this is how he looked when he gave the famous speech. You don't see the medals and the stuff, and it was cold in England, and he would go up and he would do impromptu speaking. And then later, when he knew that he was going to be in command of the Third Army, he gave a very long and in-depth speech to them, and he made fanfare of it. They would have a division or two, 15, 20,000 people would be on a hillside, and there would come the MPs with dress helmets and dress whites, and they had a touring car or Cadillac, and sometimes a command car, and they would come wheeling up with the sirens going, and he'd stand up. And see, by then, he was actually known by everybody. They even had comic books about him. And so everybody knew who General Patton was. And he gave a really fiery speech. And he was such a fiery speaker that the men said, I'd follow that man to hell. He will at least do the best he can. They weren't afraid to follow him. Now, he had detractors. He was not a perfect man. Who is? But he had that one calling, that he wanted to fulfill what he called his destiny. He wanted to lead these men into battle, and he was given the opportunity, but he almost had a problem, and it almost didn't happen. This is how he appeared to his troops, which is what I'm wearing, okay? And he had a helmet on, and he was lieutenant general at the time, and so he appeared this way, very formidable looking man. He practiced being mean, rawr, rawr. And in private he's a teddy bear, but he wouldn't ever let his men know that. And I know you can't read all of that, but it talks about the Patton speech that I just told you. But he said, you are not going to die. Only 2% of you here, right here today, will die in a major battle. Death must not be feared. In times, all of us, yes, every man is scared in his first battle. If he says he is not, he's a liar. Remember, the enemy is just as frightened as you are, and probably more so. They are not supermen. Now, do you begin to see why that speech was given? These were 19, 18, 17, 20, 22, 23-year-old boys. You know, we all think of a man at 21, but how many men are really men at 21? Especially at 19 or 18, they're away from home. They're scared to death. They have no idea. They're about to hit the Nazis. They're Hitler. All of the things they've read, all the news reports. Now they had a minimal amount of training. They're shipped over to Europe, into England, and England was they said there was so much equipment on England they were worried about it sinking. They had millions of men and equipment and tanks and trucks, and they were drilling, and they were going through all kinds of demand here in the Engineers Corps. And I talked to him earlier, and he was talking about building stuff so they could train with, and it was just a tremendous amount. And a lot of these people had no idea they were scared to death. And Patton knew it. He knew about fear. Do not take counsel of your fear. So he trained them, and he trained them, and he trained them. Now, if you were on the outside looking in, you thought he was the biggest SOB you ever saw. But he had purpose for it. And nobody messed with him. They did what he was supposed to do. The Normandy Invasion took place June 6, 1944. Patton's Third Army was held. They had planned it. It was not a spur of the moment. In the movie, you see him flying over in the airplane, and he's not sure whether he has a command, and Bradley talks to him and says, well, I didn't sure whether we were going to get along or not, and let me tell you about this plan, Operation Cobra. Baloney. They knew it. It was already planned. They knew what they were going to do. They knew when it was going to do. They knew he was going to become operational August 1st, and so they were discussing just how they were going about doing it. The logistics on moving that many people into the Normandy area was tremendous. There was millions of men and tons of equipment, and it was you just don't move all that. So they put him up to the north part of France, and they moved him from July, or last part of June, July, and they became operational August 1st. In a week's time, he went from here, he attacked in this direction, he attacked in this direction, he attacked in this direction. He caught the German army in a false pocket, and he was ready to go and cross the Rhine in a week. That's the genius of Patton. No other commander in the world could have done it, and he did it. And he said, let me go. I can take us all the way to Berlin. And I will personally shoot that paper hanging son of a bitch if you give me a chance. And every time his men, sorry, where are we going? We're going to Berlin. and years later, his nephew asked General Bradley, he said if he hadn't have been stopped, because they stopped him for his gasoline, they were firing a great many of the V-1 and V-2 rockets, and later Montgomery wanted to do Operation Market Garden and some other stuff, and they took him and made him stay in place. He asked, he said, if Uncle Georgie was allowed, could he have gone across the Rhine? Could he made it to Berlin? This is in the 1950s. And General Bradley said, you know, I believe he could have. Now I want you to think about that. The war would have been over in 1944. Some 10 million people would not have lost their lives, including a great many in the concentration camps who had not yet been killed. That's the brilliance of Patton. But he was stopped because there was political considerations. And so he did what he was told. Now, he believed in a rock soup method. I don't know how much time we got, but he believed in a rock soup method. He was told to stop, and he did. But he said, General Bradley, can I reconnoiter? Well, sure, because I need to protect my men. Okay, so he puts some group out in front. Well, he needed to protect the group that was now out in front, so he put some more people now out in front. And then he needed some gasoline, and he, of course, he didn't approve this at all. But it seems that some of his men put on Bradley's army patch, and they went over and they borrowed a little gasoline. And it was reallocation of available resources from one theater of operation to another. And of course, when he heard about it, he condemned it, but he was damn glad to get it. But that was a serious, serious mistake. Not only on the tactical tradition. When they cut his gas, they cut most of it. He couldn't even get people who were injured in the hospitals back to Paris to better hospitals because he didn't have the gasoline to do it. And he began, at that point in his career, to become very embittered about the way the war was running because he could see what could be done. He could see that it had to be done at the time, when it needed to be done, at the time it needed to be done. And he had the troops and everything to do it, but he wouldn't give them the gasoline. They wouldn't give him the go-ahead to do it. And he saw the politics of war. And he couldn't say anything because you got to remember, he knew that he was just that far from being relieved because of what had happened. So he kept his mouth shut. He wrote in his diary, read the Patton papers, but he didn't express it. Had he been free to express it, things might have been different. So things began to move. Now, I want to invite you this next year out to the Museum of the American GI. We do a World War II reenactment. This is Patton's original van. This is what he was a mobile headquarters. Let me tell you a little bit about Third Army so you understand why they were able to move as quick and as fast as they were. Everything was done in duplicate. You had he called his headquarters Lucky Forward. So he had a Lucky Forward and a Lucky Rear. He liked that. And he had a sleeping quarters. It had a sink in it. It had two phones. Contrary to popular belief, he answered to those phones all the time. One went to General Eisenhower and one went to General Bradley. He wasn't off on his own. They knew exactly what he was doing and when he was doing it and how he was doing it. It wasn't a big secret like the movies. And we have restored a World War II truck exactly as Patton had it, and we bring it out every year at the museum. So if y'all want to see what Pattons Headquarters is and you can't go to Fort Knox, we got one. Ours is better than the one at Fort Knox. Ours runs. And this is what his mobile headquarters look like. And the biggest nut that he had to crack was Metz. Metz is not one fort. It's a series of forts and it's a series of towns, and it was heavily fortified, and the Germans had got in there pretty deep, and they lost a lot of good men trying to take that out because they'd never had that type of warfare to fight with before. And it took quite a while to get Metz out of there. Patton's dog, Willie. Yeah, y'all all know him as Willie, right? Because of the Knutsford incident. The Knutsford incident was when he was in England, and he was speaking to the ladies, and he said, we are destined to rule the world, us and the British, and some say he said the Russians, and some say he didn't. And that almost got him relieved for saying that, because the politicians made big hay out of it. But the scene that I talk about is the little dog, and he comes up, and the little dog goes, and he goes back behind Patton, and he said, well, I'm going to call you William the Conqueror, but now I'm going to call you Willie. Baloney. Didn't happen. You go, didn't happen. No, it didn't happen. Willie was an English bull terrier. His name was, well, I'll tell you his name in a minute. It'll come to Punch. And he had Punch, and he had been an RAF pilot's dog, and he had taken him up in the plane and flew over Germany at night fighting, and the one time he didn't take him up, the plane was lost. And so Patton got the dog. Lady Lease, and who was the wife of one of the British generals, and Kay Summersby, who was Patton's driver, female British driver, went out and helped him find the dog. This dog would have eaten that dog. He was a bull terrier, come on. And in fact, he did lots of things he shouldn't have done, including while they were over at the European theater, he dug up a German grave and began to gnaw on the German. And he was, do something with the dog. But he loved Patton, and they got along real well. They got back in Patton's van, and the dog would snore, and Patton would snore. And it was kind of like he had a companion. And the dog lived through the war and died of old age. Next. I won't go through all the battles. Some of the battles are kind of boring if you're not into military history. But I will talk about the Battle of the Bulge. When they were spread out, Montgomery had written an assessment that there was no way that they could attack in the middle of warfare, in the middle of winter. It was the coldest winter that they had in 50 years. And so Montgomery is sitting back, not worrying about it. Eisenhower had gone away from the front. Bradley was away. And all of a sudden, here comes this juggernaut of what we call the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had decided that he could push all the way through, and if he could hit Antwerp, he could divide the forces and try to sue for peace or some sort of silly stuff. He wasn't a very good commander. One of the obvious things that they thought that they ought to have done was to kill Hitler. Well, they might have put a good commander in if they'd have killed him. And as it was, he was a horrible commander, and he kept doing things with the German army that they were beginning to revolt. And but they were soldiers, and they were given a job, and they did their best to take, and they ended up at Bastogne, and they surrounded the place, and it became a rallying cry. And they were going to reduce it, and all of the generals met, and Eisenhower was there. In the movie, he's not there, but in reality, he was there. And Patton had a man in his intelligence by the name of Oscar Koch, who was probably the finest intelligent officer they had, and predicted at that spot that there would be a bulge and a fight a week and a half before it happened. And he sent the information up, and they didn't act on it. So, and that's important to know. So Patton had set up a group of plans to do what he did. He could pull his troops out. He could bring some reserves in so it looked like the troops hadn't been pulled out. And he moved not just 3 divisions, but an entire army. He changed them, and he moved 90 degrees in the dead of winter and attacked within 3 days and relieved Bastogne. One of the finest military victories and feats of tactical awareness that any general has ever done in any army, anywhere, anytime in history, period. And because of the number of people and the type of things, it'll never be redone. Warfare has changed completely now. So he has that one spot in history of doing something that nobody else could have done but him. Let's go on to the next. He had a war room. He would get up in the morning, they'd have a conference. They would tell him about everything happening in the immediate theater, what was happening in the larger theater, what was happening with all the other armies, what was happening across the world, and what was happening in the news. He knew exactly what was going on, and he had briefings daily. Next. During the winter, it was as cold as it could possibly be. This picture was taken during that time. This is famous. That's an Aviator Jacket that was given to him by one of his aviator commanders. I'm going to move a little quickly here. There's the wheel of the 90 degrees. Go again. Famous prayer. In the movie, The prayer is written, Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee for Thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains of which we have to contend with. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon Thee, that armed with Thy power we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and the wickedness of our enemies and establish Thy justice among men and nations. That was not written for the Battle of the Bulge. It was written a little bit before, and the pastor had no problem writing it either. He was coming to Pattons Headquarters, and he said, we need to ask the Lord for our help. He says, the reason that our army has not had the pestilence and the disease and the things that normally are associated with armies in the field, because all the good people are praying for us back home and praying for their loved ones. And see, Patton, with all of his flamboyance and with all of the bad things he said and all the bad words, got down on his knees and prayed. And he prayed constantly for the welfare of his men and for his personal welfare and the welfare of his generals and the other people. And he really did care, and he prayed a lot. So he asked the pastor to give a prayer that he could give to all the men. He said, and this is from the actual, this is the man who I'm getting this information from. I actually wrote about this after the war. And I'm having a mental glitch, or I tell you his name. O'Neill. O'Neill's his name. And he wrote this, and he says, on your church services, chaplain, do y'all get down on your knees and pray? He says, no, they're standard services. We have a little prayer at the beginning and the benediction. We follow the standard. He says, no. You guys need to get down and pray. You need to ask the Lord for deliverance. We could lose this war. We could certainly have a lot of people killed. We need to ask for divine guidance. And that was and he issued an order, and it went out to all of the chaplains to do that very thing. So that's another thing we don't know about Patton that you hear. You don't see it in the movies. And so then on the back, he had a greeting from his men. Let's go on. Wished them Merry Christmas, and he got them as much hot food as he possibly could. As soon as the air cleared, they dropped food for them and blankets and all kinds of stuff to help them out. Go again. They began to surrender in groves and march, but there was an element that refused to surrender, and they would fight to the very end of it because they were soldiers. That's what soldiers did. And these were kids and old men. They were tattered groups, but they still had a lot of punch to them, and they weren't giving up. So if you ever hear that the last part of the World War II was a piece of cake, that everybody surrendered, don't you believe it, man. There was a lot of people killed, a lot of people, and it was a really hard fight. It wasn't over until it was over. Next. Then the most horrible thing that they could have ever imagined, they liberated the concentration camps. They just could not believe that people could do that to people. And this particular picture shows where they were lined up on rails, and a fire was started, and even it was so hot that the rails melted. And you saw the gallows, and you saw the prisoners of war. They were absolutely overwhelmed. They didn't know what to do with these people. They'd never seen anything like that. And they realized that the amount of disease in these camps were killing these people off really bad. And they also saw that they could spread this disease very quickly. And they experienced things. They didn't even know about people being malnutrition, that if you fed them real quickly, it'd kill them. They didn't even know that. So they were totally in the dark. They'd never seen such a gross, horrible thing as the concentration camps. And Patton saw it. He got so sick, he went behind the building and threw up. And he came back, and Patton said, we need to get our reporters out here, and we need to get as much of this on film as we possibly can, because we're going to prosecute those damn bastards just as soon as this war is over, and I don't want anybody to ever say this didn't happen again. And he talked to Eisenhower about it, and Eisenhower thought it was a good idea, and that is why you still have all these horrible images that need never, ever to be forgotten, because it really did happen. They really did go to these concentration camps. These people really were killed, and it's the worst thing that man has ever done to man until the next time. So there doesn't need to be a next time. Never, never, never again. If you ever visit Israel, you'll hear that. So they documented this, and at the Nuremberg trials, they were giving them a hard time, and they were being pompy, and they were, oh, well, we were under orders, we were this, we were that. And they played these movies for hours, and it shut them up. They knew what they'd done. Next. Hitler committed suicide. The German army capitulated. Next. Patton had a brief stay. He could relax. He was asked to send war bonds. Here's something a lot of you may not remember or don't know. There was not a great calling to go back and finish the war with Japan. They wanted it over quickly. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff were extremely worried because of the fighting with Iwo Jima and Okinawa and the hand-to-hand combat. They realized that if they invaded Japan, that they could have 1 million casualties or more. And when Roosevelt died, Truman didn't know until after he died about the atomic bomb. And he was asked his Joint Chiefs of Staff, he said, well, what are we going to do? He says, well, we're raising this money, but it's going to be a bloodbath. They're going to fight to the last person. So Patton raised money, came back. They put him in a job that he was not suited for. They made him Governor Provost General of Bavaria. And his job was to make the country work. So he looked around and saw who could make the country work and put them in charge. Some of them were former Nazis. Some of them probably should have been in charge. But they could make the country work, and they could make the bridges, and they could cut the wood, and they could do this, and they could do that. He also saw the Russians as a real threat, because he knew that anybody that goes over to some place and gets ready to leave, they pick out their stuff and leave. People weren't picking up their stuff and leaving. They were building, and it looked like they were going to be there for a while. And he had a real hate for the Russians. He knew what he called them mongrels, and he felt like they was going to have to fight them sooner or later. And he wanted to fight them then. That, in combination with the keeping people in the Nazi area. But you see, let me tell you something. General Patton was not the only one that did that. All the generals who were in charge kept former Nazis doing stuff. But because it was Patton and the press went after him with a vengeance, he was the catalyst. He was the guy that they always got in trouble for it. So Eisenhower, who by then had decided that he was going to try to run for president, saw Patton as a liability. He also saw Patton in a job that he just really wasn't real suited at. And so he relieved him of command because he said something to some reporters that, and that was fairly accurate in the movie. He wasn't riding around on a horse. He was actually in a meeting. And he said, well, they were forced, most of his words were a little bit more long than they are in the movie. He said they were forced to join the Nazi Party. What are they going to do? Not join and get killed? It's just, today we got, if a postman wants to work, he's either a Republican or a Democrat, And that was flippant conversation, but he wasn't a politician. He just told it like he thought it was. And that's probably, in some cases, the way it was. But not for Patton. That was enough. And Eisenhower relieved him. And so he put him in charge of the 15th Army, which was a paper army that they were writing history. And Patton loved history, so that wasn't a job that he didn't like, and he was tired. And he knew that he wasn't going to go over and fight in the European theater, in the Asiatic Pacific theater. And one of the reasons he told one of his aides is, well, you think Truman will sign you over there? He says, no, I don't think so. He says, why not? Well, he was a captain in artillery, and I remember in World War I, I chewed him out pretty good. So, you got to watch your mouth. You never know who's going to be over you. And but he wanted to be there. He really did. He wanted to fight. But he was bitter. He was extremely bitter. He saw that the war could have been over several different times. And he vowed that he was going to write a book. And that book was going to turn it all upside down. Had he written that book, it would have changed history. And he was writing on it. It was pretty much written. He went to go pheasant hunting. Now, I'm going to tell you this stuff that you hear about conspiracy, how they all ganged up to try to, there's a movie about it, it's baloney. Absolute, totally baloney. The night before, or the day before, he was to go back to the States his chief of staff, Hap Gay, said, "Why don't we go pheasant hunting? That can take your mind off of it." Good idea. They didn't exactly know where they were going. They knew they were going to go somewhere around Mannheim. They called the driver, who didn't know till he got a call that he was taking him. They loaded up the stuff. They went down an Autobahn. They went down another place. They didn't know that they were going. They ended up in Mannheim, went down a street they didn't know they were going to go down. And a deuce and a half, who didn't know he was there, was waiting for a train. And when the train went by, the deuce and a half turned, and he plowed into just the side of his Cadillac. In this picture. And it looks like a lot of damage there, but it wasn't. Nobody was hurt in the car except Patton. He was sitting on the side of the seat talking to Hap Gay. And when he did, he came up and he broke the back part of his neck, and he could breathe. But that was about, after that he couldn't move or feel anything. It happened very quickly. He was at the hospital in less than 30 minutes. Go ahead. And they got the best doctors they possibly could there as quickly as they possibly could. He was prone to aneurysms. He was never alone. Never alone. There was always someone with him. His wife, Beatrice, was brought in. She came over with Colonel Sperling, who was the best doctor they had, period. And he came over to see what they could do. He lingered for quite some time. Go again. And on the 23rd of December, his wife had just stepped out. The nurse looked over at Patton, saw that he'd stopped breathing. He was very still. So he was at a hospital there in Heidelberg, the 130th Hospital. Robin was stationed there when she was in the service. And it's in Heidelberg. And they did all they could. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was just his time. And they had a service there. But one of the things that a lot of people don't know, hit the next picture. I was honored, believe me. It was one of the nicest honors that has ever been given to me. I was asked to, this last year in December, to go to the hospital in Heidelberg for the 61st anniversary of his death. And those who study history know the Patton that I know. And so this is a wreath being laid in front of the hospital room that he passed away in. And it's a pretty good little ceremony. It's very private. You don't see this. This is not a big ceremony. It's just the way the soldiers feel about him, and they do it very quietly, and they do it with great honor. And they put this wreath, and it stays there all year round. They take it off and put it back on. It's not a real flowered wreath, so they can stay there all the time. And so I was asked to come do what I just did, and you just got the slideshow that I gave them. And they were wonderful people. And this is me with the commanding officer of the hospital, really nice lady, a colonel, sweet lady. And they take care of all of the soldiers, and you want some good care, you can get it there. And while I was there were some soldiers from Iraq who were in need of some care, and I met one of them. Wonderful, wonderful people. So it was an honor for me to be able to go to the actual place. The last couple of pictures. Patton would have loved this. This is the hospital room that he died in. It is now a room used for x-rays and CAT scans and to help save people's lives. And he would have loved that. So people still remember him. Patton was as bold as he gets. He's had the language of a sailor. He was not a perfect man. He made mistakes. Yet, when he did what he could do best, and when he did the best that we've ever had as a combat general, there was some, I'm sure, that have equaled him. There's no comparison today, though, and this is where I'll stop out of character and tell you, we must remember our veterans, and certainly the young men and women who are in the service today and serving all over the world. We are who they need. And the next time you pray to the Almighty, you remember that even Patton knew who was in charge, and it wasn't him. And we ask that you remember our soldiers. They're coming back with all the things that soldiers come back with, and they have all the problems that soldiers have. yet they're fighting for us because they were told to. And more so now than it was then. This is an all-volunteer force, folks. They're giving because they freely believe in freedom. Freedom is not free. And if you think voting is not important, I want you to remember that finger that had the ink on it in Iraq, where the lady went down and she put her finger, and she, with great peril to herself, said, I voted. The first time in probably her lifetime she voted. And we can't get half of our people to the polls, and these soldiers are dying for the right of other people to vote. You've got an election coming up on the 2nd. I don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat. Vote. That is what these people fought for, and what they're fighting for today is your freedom to choose. When we lose that freedom to choose, those folks will have died in vain. So you vote. I don't care what you vote, but you vote. You vote what you believe in, but you vote. It has been an honor and a privilege to talk to you today, and I will answer any questions if I haven't got to the point where y'all want to leave yet.